Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Scott Samuelson and I'm a professor of philosophy at Kirkwood Community College on the Iowa City campus. TIF, it sounds like what we call a petty argument, but TIF, T-I-F, which stands for Tax Increment Financing, has increasingly become a big quarrel, a fairly hot topic, especially in local politics. The idea of TIF is for local governments to use future gains in property taxes to subsidize projects that will lead to urban renewal or economic development. It sounds great, but some think it sounds better than it is. Would the development happen anyway? Is TIFing a kind of corporate welfare or a way to help those who are buddies with the governing body? Is TIFing fair to surrounding areas that aren't getting the subsidies? And are governments getting into debts that they won't be able to pay back? Tax increment financing was a huge issue in the recent Coralville City Council elections, and it's something that people across the state are concerned with. Is TIF a crucial tool for economic development? When is it an example of government meddling? We have a good panel on this morning to discuss TIF, and hopefully we won't have a tiff about TIF. To my left is Wendy Ford, the Iowa City Economic Development Coordinator. Thanks for being on, Wendy.
Happy to be here.
And at the end is Jeff Schott, the Director of the Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Iowa. Thanks for being on, Jeff.
Morning.
Well, Jeff, maybe let's just start by talking a little bit about what TIF is. My sense is that maybe this is not an acronym that conjures something in everyone's mind. What is TIF? Where does it come from? How does it work?
Okay, well, a little history maybe might be helpful.
Sure.
Tax increment financing was established in Iowa in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was really established by the legislature to help cities in terms of developing financing resources to match federal grant programs specifically related to urban redevelopment, the so-called urban renewal programs. There's a lot of money coming from the federal government in those areas, but they required local match. So the idea was that TIF would be a way that cities could help leverage those federal monies, with the idea being that by trying to promote development and reinvestment in a neighborhood, in a community, the idea was that the increment, the increase in property tax values could be used to help finance these types of projects. So the concept is that the local government establishes a base value of a particular property or a particular area, and then if they are successful in attracting new development, that the incremental increase in property values in that area can go back to the city to help pay for whatever they needed to do to make that development happen, in terms of perhaps they needed to do infrastructure projects, street, sewer, water, or perhaps some public facilities to make that happen. When it first started, it was strictly for urban renewal type projects, slum and blight remediation.
Right, and so like what kind of projects in particular?
Well, it was mainly like downtown redevelopment projects, right. Or if you had a really blighted residential area, it could be used to help develop those projects. A lot of times there would be acquisition of slum and blighted areas, then demolition, and then trying to attract developers for new development.
And was there some success in the urban renewal efforts?
Well, a number of communities in Iowa did do that. Iowa City was one, Cedar Rapids, Des Moines. So it was pretty successful in Iowa in those areas. The big change happened about 15, 20 years later, when the legislature expanded the use of TIF. Before, the original intent of TIF was for urban renewal, slum and blight.
Right.
Then the legislature expanded the definition to include economic development. And we can talk about that a little bit, but that really changed the whole complexion of TIF in Iowa.
Right, and what about just the finances of it itself? I mean, to what extent are you borrowing money? To what extent are you just using money that you're raising through revenue?
Well, essentially, the cities will end up or actually they will start by investing in a project, and as a way to finance that project, whether it's to put in infrastructure or for land acquisition or whatever the project entails, the idea is that the TIF is used to repay the city for those costs that they incur.
Right.
Now,
so the city goes into debt, but then they plan on getting it paid back through the TIF.
When it got expanded to economic development, the legislature authorized the cities, and counties can also do TIF, that they could actually repay developers or businesses for their development. That's been used quite frequently these days.
Right. Well, and Wendy, let's get you in on this. I mean, so I want to get in on various issues, but generally speaking, is TIF a good thing, a bad thing? When is it good? When is it bad?
Well, I think it depends on how the city decides they want to use TIF. As we know, there are all kinds of different applications across the state, and some are looked upon more favorably, some kind of fly under the radar, and some draw a lot of ire from people, or at least, maybe, if not ire, then a lot of concentration and a lot of scrutiny. Iowa City has always prided itself in being quite judicious with its use of TIF, in that we look at project-specific TIFs and limit the time frame that those projects are allowed to capture or divert taxes from the property tax stream for the use of those projects. And we feel we've done a really good job in that area. I wanted to add one other thing to what Jeff had said earlier about how where the money goes and how it can be used. Another option for cities is to provide TIF rebates to businesses or developers, and that is a way that essentially provides less risk for the city, but still allows them to participate in a development project. We have one right now where we have an industrial company that would like us to help and needs a match for some state funding, and we've figured out that we can help provide that match by rebating the taxes on the increment generated by just this small addition to the factory over the course of 4 years. So we're not out upfront money. The business has to do a good job and has to realize that project, and taxes have to begin to come in first before $1 is rebated.
Right. Okay, so let me ask you this. I mean, I'm imagining that if we're offering a financial incentive for some kind of business to come in, they're almost all going to say, we need the financial incentive. And how do you know whether such an incentive is really necessary for them or not to come in? I mean, maybe such things would happen naturally. I mean, isn't that sort of the idea that if there's even a blighted area that, well, property values are low, that will attract people in who are willing to take risks there? How do you know that they need the extra money in order to offer it?
I think first you have to look at the urban renewal area in which a person or a company or a developer is wanting to do a project. And when those areas are founded, there are some objectives that the city council or the governing body has written out, and those are the guidelines for that area. So question number one is, does the project actually fit the guidelines, and would it help us meet the goals for the urban renewal area that we have here? Secondly, the city of Iowa City, anyway, started a couple of years ago doing an in-depth, what we call a financial gap analysis.
Right. What is that exactly? I've heard about this gap analysis.
Well, it's actually made it a lot simpler for us to evaluate requests for financial assistance, because as you say, everybody comes to you saying, boy, I could sure use a little more money for this project. Well, couldn't we all, for sure. So we give them a list of 20 pieces of information, the critical pieces of which are how much is it going to cost to get this project out of the ground? In other words, the project development cost sheet. Then we want to know how that project runs. So if it's an apartment building, or if it's a multi-use or commercial building, or even industrial, what kind of revenues will that building produce? Are you selling units in it? Are you renting units in it? In other words, what kind of income stream is that project going to provide to the developer? And then we ask for a list of, before we even consider $1, we ask for a list of the financial resources that the developer has been able to put together. And that must include a substantial amount of developer equity, skin in the game, in other words. It usually, most often, involves some sort of conventional loan financing, and sometimes there will be other investment partners as well. And when we look at all of the factors that value a project, that show the income stream, that show the returns back to the developer, most importantly, that is, how much money is that developer going to be earning on that amount of equity that they've put in it, do we begin to see if there's actually a gap or not. So if the developer can attract more debt, then why would they need public financing? So we now have the tools to be able to evaluate that gap to that level of detail.
And are all cities and counties using gap analysis, or is this something that is used by some and not others?
I think it's used by some and not others. I can't speak for other cities, but I know that it's been a wonderful tool for us to be able to help the development community actually know what they need to bring forward in order to request assistance.
Well, just so people listening to this have something to kind of think about concretely, what are some examples of either successful TIF projects that people might be familiar with? And are there any examples that you can think of things that maybe were not successful, and why not? Jeff, what?
I think there are many examples of successful projects across the state of Iowa, whether it is a new plant, a new industry that's located. I was city manager in Marion before my job at the University of Iowa.
Right.
There was quite a bit of industrial development on the east edge of Marion that was made possible through the use of TIF. Most of that was through the rebates that Wendy talked about to work with developers to try to promote that development. It is very, very important for the city or the county to really determine what are their goals, what are the criteria that they want to use to make that judgment as to whether or not to use TIF. And one size does not fit all. I mean, what may work in Iowa City may not work in a small town, say in north central Iowa. And for some communities, what they really need is retail. Other communities are looking for manufacturing or office warehousing or whatever it might be. So they really need to determine what it is that they want in terms of economic development and what is the best way to go about it. For some communities, they may need to extend sewer or water or paving to make an area ready for development. And the way to finance that infrastructure is through TIF. And there are many, many examples throughout the state of Iowa where they've used that.
Well, and it does seem like one of the government's most powerful ways to attract businesses or whatever you want to have. Maybe it's only
one
way
of
in
our
some
only
ways.
tools, actually.
Right. But, okay, same question to you, Wendy. I mean, so what are some examples of success or failure that you think we should be thinking about here?
Well, success has come to mind, and one of the ones that I just realized, actually, in thinking about coming on this morning, was in one of our industrial parks. We've had an urban renewal area to help with economic development projects for these industries. We've assisted a couple of them out in that area to the tune of about $2.1 million. And each year now, the incremental taxes that our $2.1 million have helped draw another $500,000 per year in property taxes. So you can see it only takes 4 years to pay off that kind of investment, essentially 4.5 or so. The other upside are the jobs. Now, with the expansions that these companies have been able to make, they've been able to go from combined about 350 or so employees to now more than 520 employees. And we see that as a huge benefit. And incidentally, I want to note that these are good jobs, and at least the city of Iowa City requires that the average wages of the jobs in a project that we assist are at or above, preferably, the county median.
Right. Well, that's another thing that I wanted to ask about generally is if I get a TIF, what am I on the hook for exactly? I mean, what sorts, I mean, to some degree I might have to pay back money, I may have to hire a certain number of people, I may have to pay them a certain amount. I mean, what kinds of things am I going to be on the hook for if I get such a tax increment financing? It
depends on what kind of a project you're representing. Certainly in the industrial areas that we have a minimum threshold of valuation improvement that we require. We generally have a jobs requirement that also has, that has a number of jobs they have to either retain or add, and also a minimum wage requirement as well. Then frequently there'll be other components as well, depending on what kind of project it is. So in the case of perhaps a downtown TIF project, we required in the Plaza Tower project that there be a grocery store on the main floor. Well, that developer didn't necessarily want to put a grocery store on the main floor, but that was a requirement, and for them to be able to maintain that TIF, they had to perform to that standard. And there were a list of a dozen different requirements that developed.
So it helps to become part of almost city planning at the same time. Yeah.
And I'd like to point out that really varies from place to place.
Right.
And some cities have very elaborate processes and criteria and requirements that they insist are part of a development agreement. And every TIF project has some sort of development agreement. And some are quite elaborate, and others are pretty open and pretty simple.
Right.
And that's going to vary from location to location.
And while it seems like obviously a government, one hopes, a governing body, whoever is performing this, is going to make a kind of prudent investment and have a TIF that's likely to pay off. I mean, there is an element of gamble. It is business, and there's the possibility that things are not going to work out, right?
Well, and that's where Wendy talked about the idea of a rebate agreement, which is as part of that development agreement, the city provides that TIF on an annual basis. They provide that increment to the developer on an annual basis, and it is subject to that developer or that business performing, meeting those criteria, that whether it's a number of jobs or the X number of square feet need to be built, et cetera. Another way of financing TIF is through the issuance of bonds. And cities can issue TIF bonds. But when they do that, the city can assume a large amount of risk because the city is still going to be responsible for paying off those bonds. That development or that business may or may not be in operation 5 years from now, and those bonds may still need to be paid off in 5 or 6 or 8, 10 years. And so you talk about some areas where there's been some problems. It has been where the business has ceased operation, yet the city is still going to be out there and responsible for paying those bonds. There's ways to try to move that risk on the bonds to the developer, to the business, but that can get pretty dicey sometimes.
Right. Well, what about another example that caused some controversy in Coralville? As I understand, the Von Maur was brought in through TIF money, so it's taken from, or is lured from Iowa City and the Sycamore Mall out to Coralville and to the Iowa River Landing. And for quite a bit of money was the TIF involved. I mean, I've heard different estimates of it, but 10 million, I've heard up to $16 million. And a lot of people felt like this was overreach. People felt like this is the government kind of meddling in a situation. Maybe even, I heard people accused of greed in Coralville, that they were simply trying to take a business, is that an example of something that is a bad use of TIF money?
I'll let Wendy take that.
Thanks, Joe.
I work with both cities.
Right. I would say, I don't know if I want to call it good or bad. There was a lot of discussion about how beneficial it is to either community to take an established retail business and put it into, take it from one community and move it for 5 miles or so to the other community. The law, as stated, said that is all right if there's a substantial improvement. And so you get down to splitting hairs, at least in the legalese, and if nothing else, you raise a few hackles in the community. And I think that has happened, although I think that's water over the dam, and we're moving past that now.
Right. But I mean, I know in Coralville, many people are worried about the government already overextending itself, and the fear is that here's one more example of the government kind of overextending itself.
We would like to see there be more agreement to not encroach on our neighbor's business.
Right. Okay, fair enough. What about another concern that I know that people often have, which is that there's always the fear in government that, you know, when the government starts getting involved in business, the government is going to be helping out their friends and hurting their enemies, or showing favor to some and not to others. And part of the beauty that people see in the free market is that, well, it's open to all, it's free to all. How can the government ensure that there's not going to be something like some kind of cronyism going on?
Well, I think the important thing is to start with the basic premise of economic development planning that Wendy talked about, what Iowa City's done, a lot of other cities have done, to number one, identify what it is that you want for your community in this particular area. The plan is developed. Hopefully you receive a lot of citizen input in the process, public notice, hearings, those types of things. And then when projects are reviewed, the real question is, does this meet the needs and the requirements of our plan? And hopefully when you look at that, you can remove the issue of cronyism. The question is this compatible with what we want? Is this compatible with our vision for our community, for this area? I mean, certainly every city council faces that issue, whether it's with economic development incentives or zoning requests, subdivisions. It really doesn't matter. That's going to be an issue, and there are laws on the state in terms of trying to protect against those types of things and conflict of interest. The idea is, hopefully in a very transparent, open way, going through the economic development planning process, your comprehensive planning process, what is it that you want for your community? What are the tools that you are prepared to offer? And those tools should be available for any developer, any business, as long as they meet the criteria that the city has set out.
Mm-hmm. Is that something that you feel like one has to wrestle with seriously, the worry that one gets involved in a kind of cronyism or favoritism?
I don't think so. I mean, we may have some grumbling about, in Iowa City, for example, we have one developer that's been prolific and done some really wonderful things in downtown. That's Mark Moen. And some people might argue that he gets all the TIF money.
Right.
Well, he doesn't get all the TIF money, but he brings these projects that are worthy of consideration, that meet the goals,
right,
that meet the goals of the urban renewal area, that meet the financial requirements, that show that he does not receive undue enrichment, we call it, from his returns in the project, and thus and then through the public process merits the go-ahead to do this project with the public benefits and.
Right, but I do know that there's grumbling as well, like you say. So I mean, it's a difficult issue. I suppose that's always going to be a difficult issue when the government does get involved. So then, what about just the general criticism? I remember I brought this up recently to someone. I was doing a show on tax increment financing TIFs, and the person said to me, "Oh, you mean corporate welfare?" Is this corporate welfare?
I don't think it is. Now, it could be if it was misused. I think the real issue is, what is it that you want to get done? You know, you pay attention to campaigns, whether it's for municipal elections or for the state legislature. Very, very frequently, the candidates stress the need for economic development in their community, right, the need for jobs, the need for growth. Well, how do you get that done? There are very limited tools available in Iowa to accomplish that. And we have to face facts that this is a very competitive situation. You do have to be careful about one city grabbing something from another city, but it's also true that the state of Iowa is competing against not only the states in the upper Midwest, but all across the country and in fact the world. And so you have to put together a package that is competitive, yet you also have to make sure that you're safeguarding the city's money and the state's money. And doing that gap analysis that Iowa City does is a very excellent way of at least doing a thoughtful analysis. What are the benefits that we're going to be receiving? What are the costs? Does this development warrant an investment and use of dollars, whether it's tax increment dollars or infrastructure dollars from other sources of money? What does it make sense for our community?
Well, one thing that I think would be helpful, I wonder if sometimes people worry that TIF often takes place within a kind of black box, that there isn't enough transparency to it and how it goes on, and maybe this fuels some of the worries about cronyism or corporate welfare. Is there any way that one can make it a more transparent system, or a system where the public feels like they know more about it and they see what's going on?
It is incumbent upon the public to pay attention. I would say that's rule number one. But built into the laws, there are plenty of touch points with the public that we request for which we request their input. To even enact an urban renewal area, the council has to approve a resolution of necessity for that. Just that act is step one. Then there has to be a consultation with the other taxing entities in the nearby area in the county. Then there has to be a planning and zoning hearing. Then there has to be a public hearing, and then finally an adoption of a plan. And before there can even be a project in that plan, we're already talking about 5 council meetings here, there has to be a development agreement that sets forth the rules and the performance measures that will be expected of the developer. So lots of opportunities, but people do need to pay attention.
Right, so in some sense it's the public's duty to show up at these meetings,
Yeah,
you're saying?
yeah.
Yeah. What do you think about how can we make things more transparent, Jeff?
I think it's a fairly transparent process. The problem is it's pretty complicated.
Right.
And somebody has to be really interested to look into it. But all of those documents that Wendy just talked about are public documents. And now the legislature in the last year or so actually requires more information to be provided by the cities and the counties to the state. All of those documents, all of that information is available. It's online. It's all public documents. So if people want to know what urban renewal areas, what TIF areas are currently in place in our city, they can find that out very easily. But it does get it's going to take a little bit of work on their part just to ask that question.
Right. Well, I'm afraid we're running out of time here, but I'd like to thank you both for a stimulating discussion. I'm sort of hoping that the discussion we've had here is helping to get people to focus on this a little bit and to look at it and to think about what kind of value should we be bringing to bear on this tax increment financing TIF stuff. So thanks again once more, Wendy and Jeff, for being on and having a good conversation. I hope the conversation we've started here is one that people continue in their homes and communities. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on Ethical Perspectives on the News.